Fidelity studied 9 million retirement accounts in 2023 and found that the median 401k balance for someone in their 60s is just $210,000. Not $500,000, not a million, $210,000 after a 40-year career. And here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. The math says almost every one of those people should have crossed $500,000 by their late 50s. They didn't. Roughly 9 out of 10 investors never break the $500,000 compound threshold, and the reasons have almost nothing to do with how much they earned. I'm Joe. This channel is about the boring math nobody explains until it's too late. Today I'm going to show you why that $500,000 wall exists, the psychology that traps people just below it, and the 4 specific moves that get you across. Let's start with the wall itself because most people don't even know it exists. If you invest $500 a month starting at age 25, earning 8% a year, you cross $500,000 at roughly age 53. That's the textbook path. Simple. Boring. It works. But Vanguard's How America Saves report from 2023 tells a different story. The average 401k balance for Americans aged 55 to 64 is around $244,000. The median is $87,000. Let that sink in. Half of Americans approaching retirement have less than 90 grand saved. So where's the disconnect? People aren't bad at math, they're bad at staying in the seat. Here's the pattern interrupt I want you to sit with. According to a study by Dalbar, the average equity fund investor earned about 6% a year over the last 30 years, while the S&P 500 returned about 10%. That 4% gap doesn't sound like much, but over 30 years on a $10,000 starting investment, that gap is the difference between $174,000 and $57,000. The market did its job. The investor didn't. So the first reason 90% never cross $500,000 isn't income, it's behavior. Specifically, 3 behaviors I'll break down in a second. But I want you to remember the headline number here, 4%. That's the behavioral tax most investors pay every single year without realizing it. And in about 6 minutes, I'm going to show you the exact account structure that eliminates most of that tax automatically. Stick with me, because it's the single highest leverage move you can make this year. Now here's where it gets weird. You'd think the people who never cross $500,000 are the ones who don't save. And that's partly true. But there's a second group, and they're bigger than you'd guess. These are people who saved consistently, got to about $150,000 or $200,000, and then froze. Why? Let's get into the psychology, because this is the part that actually changes how you behave. In 1979, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky published a paper called Prospect Theory. It won Kahneman the Nobel Prize in economics. The core finding was this: the pain of losing $100 is roughly twice as intense as the pleasure of gaining $100. Loss aversion isn't a metaphor. It's a measurable asymmetry in how your brain processes money. Now apply that to a portfolio. When you have $20,000 invested and the market drops 30%, you lose $6,000. That hurts, but you can stomach it. When you have $300,000 invested and the market drops 30%, you lose $90,000. Same percentage, completely different emotional experience. That's more than most people make in a year, evaporated in a few months. So what do? They sell, or they shift to bonds, or they stop contributing. They don't say, "I'm panicking." They say things like, "I'm being prudent," or "I'm getting closer to retirement, I should be more conservative." Here's the rhetorical question. If you genuinely believe the market would recover, would moving to cash feel prudent? Or would it feel like throwing away a sale? The answer tells you whether you're thinking or reacting. And there's a second psychological trap that hits right around the $200,000 to $400,000 range. Researchers call it the Endowment Effect. Once you have a meaningful amount of money, you start treating it like something you need to protect, rather than something you need to grow. Your brain reclassifies the portfolio from money I'm building to money I have. And the goal silently shifts from compounding to preserving. This is the moment most investors stop crossing thresholds. They didn't fail to save. They succeeded at saving and then quietly stopped letting their money do its job. There's a famous Fidelity internal study that supposedly found their best performing accounts belonged to people who had either forgotten they had an account or were dead. Fidelity has never officially confirmed it, but the principle behind it is real and has been replicated in academic research. The less you touch a diversified portfolio, the better it tends to perform. Activity is the enemy of compounding. So we've covered the behavioral tax, and we've covered the loss aversion freeze. Here's where it gets practical, because everything I've said so far is useless if you don't change what you actually do on Monday morning. So far, you've seen the 4% behavior gap, and you've seen the psychology that creates it. But here's the part most people never figure out. The fix isn't more discipline. Discipline fails. The fix is structure that makes discipline unnecessary. Step 1. Automate every contribution. Not most, every single one. If you're putting money into your 401k, your Roth IRA, your brokerage account, set it on automatic transfer the day after payday. The number doesn't matter as much as the automation. Vanguard's research shows that auto-enrolled employees have a 92% participation rate, compared to 62% for those who have to opt in. Same people, same incomes. The only difference is whether they had to make a decision. When you make investing a decision, you'll skip it. When you make it a default, you'll do it for 30 years without thinking. That's how compounding actually happens in real life. Step 2. Pick one diversified index fund and stop researching. I'm going to be direct here. The single biggest reason people underperform isn't picking the wrong fund. It's picking too many funds, then switching between them. A total stock market index fund or an S&P 500 index fund with an expense ratio under 0.1% is genuinely good enough. Vanguard's VTI, Schwab's SWTSX, Fidelity's FZROX. Pick one. Done. The investor who buys VTI in 2024 and holds it until 2054 will almost certainly outperform the investor who keeps switching between the latest top-rated funds. Not because VTI is magic, because not switching is magic. Step 3. Increase contributions by 1% every year automatically. Most 401k plans now have a feature called Auto-Escalation. You set it once, and your contribution rate goes up 1% every year on your work anniversary, usually capped at 10 or 15%. If you're contributing 5% now, you'll be at 10% in 5 years, and you won't even feel it, because the increase comes out of your raise before it ever hits your checking account. Here's the math. Someone earning $70,000 who contributes 5% will have roughly $400,000 after 30 years at 8%. Same person with auto-escalation hitting 10% will have over $700,000. That's a $300,000 swing from one checkbox. Step 4, and this is the one nobody talks about. Build what I call a do-nothing rule. Write down on paper the following sentence. I will not change my investments based on any news event, market drop, or economic prediction for the next 10 years. Sign it, date it, tape it inside the cabinet where you keep your important documents. This sounds silly. It is not silly. The average investor makes their worst decisions during the 48 hours after a major market event. Having a pre-committed rule written before the panic is the single most effective behavioral hedge you can build. Researchers call this a Ulysses contract, named after Odysseus tying himself to the mast so he couldn't respond to the sirens. You're tying yourself to the mast against your own future panic. If you do those 4 things, automate, pick one fund, auto-escalate, and pre-commit to not selling, the math takes care of itself. You don't need to be smart. You don't need to read earnings reports. You don't need to predict anything. You just need to not interrupt the process for 30 years. Let's talk about why this works mechanically, because I want you to feel the math, not just trust it. Compounding is exponential, not linear. The first $100,000 is the hardest. Charlie Munger said it took him a long time to make his first $100,000, and after that it got noticeably easier. He wasn't being humble. He was describing the curve. Here's why. At $100,000 earning 8%, you make $8,000 a year from your investments. That's about as much as you contribute. So your portfolio is roughly doubling its growth rate compared to when you started. At $250,000, your investments earn $20,000 a year, which is more than most people contribute. The portfolio is now growing faster from returns than from contributions. At $500,000, you're earning $40,000 a year just from being invested. That's a full-time entry-level salary generated by money you already have. Your portfolio is now compounding on itself faster than you can possibly add to it. This is the threshold 90% of investors never cross. Not because the market doesn't cooperate. The market cooperates almost every decade if you give it time. They never cross it because they interrupt the curve. They sell during a downturn at $180,000. They pause contributions at $250,000 to buy a bigger house. They get scared at $400,000 and shift to bonds. Each of those decisions feels reasonable in the moment. Each one resets the compounding curve and pushes the $500,000 threshold 5, 10, 15 years further out, or out of reach entirely. So when I say 90% never cross $500,000, I'm not saying 90% are bad with money. I'm saying 90% let one of three moments, a market crash, a lifestyle upgrade, or a fear of loss, pull them off the curve at exactly the wrong time. Let me bring this all together. The wall isn't financial, it's behavioral. Dalbar showed us the 4% gap between the market's return and what investors actually earn. Kahneman and Tversky showed us why. Loss aversion makes the pain of a 30% drop on $300,000 feel unbearable, even when the math says hold. And the endowment effect quietly shifts your goal from growing your money to protecting it, right at the moment growth matters most. The fix is structural. Automate contributions, so the decision happens once, not monthly. Pick one diversified low-cost index fund and stop optimizing. Auto-escalate by 1% every year so your raises become your wealth. And pre-commit to a do-nothing rule before the next market panic, not during it. If you do those four things, you're not going to be the average investor. You're going to be the boring investor who looks up in 20 years and realizes the wall everyone talks about never actually existed for them, because they never gave themselves the chance to interrupt the curve. Here's what I want you to take away. You don't need to earn more. You don't need to time the market. You don't need to find the next great stock. You need to set up a system that runs without your emotions and then get out of its way for 3 decades. That's it. That's the whole game. If this helped, subscribe. I make videos like this every week, breaking down the math and the psychology nobody explained to you in school. And next week, I'm covering the 3 tax moves that quietly add another $200,000 to most portfolios over a career. You won't want to miss it. I'm Joe. Keep it boring, keep it automatic, and I'll see you in the next one.